And so switching gears, but it is, I think every meeting's a little bit better when we open with students, and next month is one of our student recognition board meetings as well, and we'll have hopefully several hundred students receiving medals that night. So those are always the highlight of what we do, because tonight what we have in front of us is the public hearing on the school budget, and that is not always the certainly a cheery endeavor this year in particular. And so I'm not, if you've watched any of the board meetings for the past 5 years, if you've looked at our webpage about our work in advocating for students, if you've seen any of the videos that I've sent home to our community of 200,000, if you've read any of the letters I've written to our legislative leaders, and if you've read any of the testimony that I've put forth before the Senate Budget Committee, the Assembly Budget Committee, as well as the Joint Committee, you know exactly where we've been as it relates to school funding and Senate Bill 2, and the position that legislative change in school funding has put the Freehold Regional High School District in. And so it's difficult because when you alert the community that difficult decisions are coming and that reduction in programs and less opportunity. I mean, you just heard two of the exec student cabinet members talk about the opportunities in this district. And so the work we've done in having our budget, you know, we've had our aid slashed now approximately $25 million. And so that's $25 million on approximately $190 million budget for reference. What has guided us in our decision making to manage that drawdown is to preserve the academic programs and the opportunities for the students that you just heard from. And so that's what guides us in our decision making, and that's what's guiding us in the budget that Mr. Boyce is going to present this evening. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind and to remember, and you know, first and foremost, without legislative change to the school funding formula, what we're going through tonight is still only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's going to happen to this school district. And I've said repeatedly that some communities, as a result of S2, are really going to face the evisceration of their public schools. And we are one of those communities. So right now, the adequacy line that the state draws in terms of what you're supposed to spend, right? So the courts have said that the state is required to provide a thorough and efficient education for all students. And as a result of determining what that thorough and efficient education is, the state draws an adequacy line of what you're supposed to fund your schools. The Freehold Regional High School District with this budget will be $20 million below the state's own line of what is determined thorough and efficient for our children. Now, we were fortunate. A couple things happened over the past couple years, and I've said this repeatedly. COVID masked a lot of our financial difficulties. We would have been here last year if we hadn't received the federal dollars that we received from the pandemic. And what happened with those dollars, to the tune of about $9 million, they masked some of the budget holes in the reduction that we had. And so that allowed us also to manage some of this for a little bit longer. And you know, we've continued to kick the can down the road as long as we could in the hopes that something would happen with the school funding itself. I've said it time and time again, we've been engaged in a multi-year lawsuit with the Department of Education. We've prevailed, but we still can't make hide nor hair of the formula itself. As a matter of fact, the figures that they turned over to us actually disappear once you enter them into the software. Just think about that. if I stood up here tonight and said, our budget's $194 million this year, but when you go home to see what we're spending it on, and when you enter it into that category, it disappears, I don't think I'd be sitting in this seat very long. That's what we're up against with the Department of Ed. We're at the point of making some very difficult decisions. I want to highlight a couple things long-term that frame what's happening tonight. At the conclusion of this budget, we will have eliminated 132 positions since I've been here. We will have eliminated over 15% of our administrative staff. Our per pupil expenditure is almost $5,000 now, less than comparable school districts per pupil. Our administrative costs are 24% less than the state average. Our class sizes of 31 plus have increased from approximately 150 classes across the district in 2018 to somewhere north of 450 of those classes this year. That's the context of where we make very difficult decisions, and the board is going to have to make some difficult decisions, and we're going to manage that as much as we can, but there's only certain buckets that comes from. It comes from staff, it comes from additional fees and sources of revenue, and it comes from reducing things that we are not compelled by law to do. And that will bring us to the conversation this evening. The budget that's being presented tonight includes another 19.4 positions being eliminated this year, bringing us to that 132 total since I've been here, but over 50 in the past 3 years alone. So with that context, Mr. Boyce, I'll turn it over to you, and you can go through the budget itself.
Thanks, Dr. Sampson. And you know that from the comments that the superintendent just made, you know, the core issue with Freehold Regional's budget, and there are other districts in a similar position, is the legislative environment about how to fund school districts, right? And then from that, the impact is pervasive in many other areas of the school district. And it's important, it's always been important for us that the community is fully aware. The more the community knows, the better off the district is. And in this particular case, with legislative interpretations of the original intent of the budget law and how schools should be funded, Freehold Regional's landed on the wrong side of that. So here are some of the core areas that I want to talk about here tonight. It's a $200 million plus annual operation, and it's revenue-driven operation, right? So that's what drives the decisions are made on the appropriations side. In terms of revenue, there are essentially only two players, state and local, and that's really where the core of the issue is about who is going to be responsible for which piece of that. The adequacy budget, as was just explained, is the state's calculation of how much it should cost for a district to provide a thorough and efficient education. So we'll talk about how they come about that number, but I'll tell you that it is specific to each district, right? Because no two districts have the same enrollment, have the same student demographic. So from that, you know, we'll see how this S2 and the funding formula, also known as, how that influences and permeates all areas of our operation. The decisions that we've made along the way in the 5 years that S2 has been in place, out of a 7-year phase-in, where the state money is shifting from school districts that are perceived to have the ability to pay for their own education to school districts that do not have the same ability to pay for their own education. So those are the things we're looking at. As Superintendent mentioned, the elimination of courtesy busing is something that is, of course, a very difficult decision. It's going to be very disruptive to a significant portion of our families to transition to the elimination of courtesy busing, but also the staff, and that's a compounding effect. And many of the things we'll see here tonight, it's also a compounding effect of the changes made under Senate Bill number 2, or S2. And also the capital funding perspective, how we've gone about that in the past and how that looks now and how we see it looking in the future. So just a quick overview on the revenue slide. And as you can see, it's all in all a $2 million plus operation per year. But the organization structurally, it's broken down into funds, right? But far and away, the most significant fund is the general fund. That's where everything that you're going to normally think of a school district doing, that's where that's housed. There's also a special revenue fund and a debt service fund. So let me start at the bottom there. The community passed a referendum in November of 21. The year that we're in, FY, which is fiscal year FY 23, was the first year of payment on that 20-year bond, right? And that was intended to address top-tier priority roofing and paving projects, right? So the most imminent projects, the things that were 3 to 5 years out didn't make it into that referendum. It was only the things that need to be done now or should have been done a year or two ago, right? So the most imminent projects. And that's what the debt service looks like. Special revenue fund are state and federal funds that are earmarked for specific purpose. Now this is also a significant influence on the condition of our general fund, and let me explain why. The federal government put out 3 rounds of funding for schools, municipalities, and other organizations, but for schools to recover from the COVID, from the pandemic, right? And the early part of that was a reopening plan, right? So to get your facilities straight, keep things safe, and then that also moved on to, over the 3, learning loss and addressing that, as well as mental health issues, and some of the behaviors that as kids come back from COVID to get them readjusted to life in school. So that money has run its course, and the remains of it are included in the FY24 budget, but it was spent on COVID-specific situations, right? It wasn't used to fund ongoing operations. The issue is that as the money diminishes, the needs have not. So a lot of those needs, particularly in the area of mental health, they remain, they persist, right? And so the impact of that is the responsibility for funding them moves from the special revenue fund into the general fund and puts further pressure on the demand for the limited resources that we have. So as I said earlier, the 2 main players in a school budget are state and local as far as funding. Let me just hit some of the highlights here. By local, that's property taxes primarily, as you can see is the largest number on the screen, but it's also fund balance that's appropriated, that's a local contribution, and some other smaller scale stuff. But so property taxes are the main local piece of that. The state aid piece of that, you can see here that we've lost another $6.7 million under this 7-year phase out of funding. That was, this is year 6 of year 7. So we projected there's another $2 million to go beyond that. But what happened when the cuts were so significant this year, and they came out in March, is that the legislature regrouped, and Senator Gopal sponsored some legislation to award what they called supplemental stabilization aid. Importantly, this was not a restoration of aid, of reduced aid under S2. This was not a restoration of the $6.7 million cut. This was a 1 year only. So what that serves to do is simply defer the cut for another year, because it's very clear in the legislation that this is a one-time appropriation of money. So while that did soften the landing for this year, it's not a fix, it's just a 1 year deferral rather than a restoration of funds. Other areas of the budget, and I'll talk to us here, one of the responses to the impact of S2 over the 5 years, now 6 years that it's been in play is the strategies that we use to develop our budget have changed, right? Our tolerance for risk needed to go up, right? And what that means is that built into any annual operating budget is funding to handle the unforeseen, or some would call it contingency. I call it the inevitable, because it's going to happen. We just don't know what it is yet, not until it happens. That has been compressed, right? So the ability to be nimble and address things, we've increased our risk for that. The other impact of that is that less is remaining at the end of any given year, which means, and what remains lapses into fund balance, which is then used to support a future year, a subsequent year. So as budgets get tighter, less lapses, and then less fund balance is available for subsequent budgets. So we've been very aggressively drawing down our surplus in order to backfill the gaps of the cuts in state aid over the first 5 years, knowing full well that that would also run its course, okay? So those are some of the other impacts. And finally, one other impact has to do with capital planning. So this district has a really strong history of providing for big ticket facility improvements, or if you need to replace a roof, it's not necessarily an improvement, but it's the critical maintenance of the facilities. We've been managing those things within the confines of an annual budget. We've been able to do that. It's something that we've not been able to do since the inception of S2, which means that if you're not able to manage those within those confines of an annual budget, your only other option is a referendum, right? And we had a referendum, and as I told you, it was just for the most severe conditions to address those. But we're in a position where we need to rethink our capital funding strategy because our ability, as I said, to handle that within operating budgets and fund what are called facility reserves, which are, think of set-aside funds dedicated to big-ticket facility types things. We haven't been able to put money into that, and we haven't been able to manage it within our budget. So these are some of the domino effects of S2, is that other choices are being made over these years, knowing that they will run their course, and we're going to reach a point where those are no longer viable options of any significance. So you can see what the design of it this year looks like. And further on in the presentation, we'll talk about what the trajectory looks like in the future here. But so let's get to sort of the core of the issue. And I only want to talk about this in a very conceptual way because it's a pretty straightforward approach to how the state designed what's called the School Funding Reform Act. It was put in place back in fiscal year '09. And how they approached it was quite simply a two-step process. The first being, how much should it cost? And the second step being, how are we going to pay for it, right? So I think it's a sound approach, makes sense. So what they designed and they periodically update a cost model. That cost model is uniform, applied to all districts, that approximates the costs of students of different characteristics, right? And then each district's actual enrollment profile, their student demographics, are pushed through that cost model to arrive at what's called the adequacy budget, as in an adequate amount of money to provide a thorough and efficient education. So pretty straightforward, very specific to each district to identify at least here's the target amount that the school district's going to need. Now, in order to pay for it, the state's approach is community first through what's called your local fair share. And then to the extent the local fair share is not able to meet adequacy, the state aid picks up the difference to arrive at adequacy so that, in theory, all districts will have an adequate amount of money to provide a thorough and efficient education. Their constitutional obligation is to provide all students a thorough and efficient education, so they needed to design a way to get there. There are certain aspects of this that have, I believe, lost fidelity with the spirit and the design of the SFRA, and that's really where the core problem lies. So the local fair share, so let's think about this. To quantify a community's ability to pay for its own education. So there's no straightforward, direct way to do that, but they did come up with a methodology, and it looks like this. They take the communities, two wealth indicators from the communities. One is the current market value of the property, right? And the other is district income from the most recent state tax return filings. So that's their two data points on measuring the community's wealth and their ability to pay. They then convert those two numbers into what you can afford in property taxes. And then according to the 5 circles there, to the extent that that local fair share doesn't meet adequacy, the state backfills the rest or compensates the rest in order to reach adequacy. So here's what it looks like. Green lines are what actually happened. Red lines are what the funding formula calculated to happen. Now, the funding formula, which has been in place since 2009, has never entirely been adhered to. It was either underfunded, ignored altogether, and there was a stretch of years where every district got the same amount that they got the year before. And the third component of the complication of that is that there is a separate independent law that governs the amount you can increase a property tax levy. So, but back to, let's look at the green line, or the green lines on the state aid side. So you can see the stretch of years there where it's just same as last year. But you can see it's fallen significantly, and that's since the inception of S2, which sought to bring things back into alignment. Our local fair share on this side is, as you can see, it's volatile as it moves around. I'll give you some stats that hopefully, put that into context for you. If our local fair share has increased 86% during the course of this new funding formula. Yet our property values have only increased 37%, and our income has only increased 63%. So the trick here is that these multipliers that convert those numbers into ability to pay, they're all over the place. They're never the same from one year to the next. There's no justification as to where they came from. The lawsuit Dr. Sampson referred to was, where do those multipliers come from that convert our two wealth indicators into our ability to pay? According to the SFRA, according to the state, we should be taxing at $184 million. Our current tax levy is $152 million. So they think that property taxes should be increased by 20% for the taxpayers of Freehold Regional in order to, the community to pay its fair share for funding adequacy. And then they use that number to back into then how much state aid should you get in order to, together with your local fair share, reach it. The problem is districts like ours can't access their local fair share. I can't go from 150 to 184, not that I would want to, but there's a separate independent law capping increases on the tax levy by 2%. So this is why we end up with local and state together being $20 million below adequacy, right? So it is mind-boggling to me that the state would allow school districts to continue to operate with, by their own measure and calculation, $20 million less than they need to provide a thorough and efficient education. But this is all part of the shift of dollars moving away from certain districts and to other districts based on this measure of need, which we question and have questioned since day one. if the multipliers had stayed the same from the first year to the current year, the red line at 184 would be 149,500,000. So that's how much influence just those changes in multipliers have on the measure of a community's ability to pay for its own education. And the resulting shortfall, being below adequacy, is where we're pressed to make changes based on the amount of revenue available. And as I mentioned earlier, we've done that through a variety of ways of managing our budgets that have served its purpose along the way, but they're not long-term solutions. Just some other slides for context. You know, it's going back, there was a time that the funding formula said that we were entitled to $51 million of state aid, equalization aid specifically. So the far side of the previous graph. And that's now down to 2.7 million, right? So it's a 95% loss of eligibility for state aid, which is a shift then to the local fair share. This is the aid as calculated. The next slide. So it's an interesting thing to track of, okay, so who funds adequacy, right? How are we going to pay for it piece, local and state? So if we drop back to 2013, the community was responsible for 68% of that, and the state for 31% of that. That has moved to almost exclusively the local community's responsibility to fund adequacy, where we only have, 1.5% remaining. That's a 95% reduction in our eligibility for state funding. So in the end, and just to finish up of how the state funding formula works, the calculation of ability to pay, or how much should it cost, is pretty pure, right? Because the student demographics is going to be spot on. The cost model is not completely up to date, we feel, on what the actual costs to run schools are. But at least it's universally applied and it affects everybody equally. The real crux of the problem is the local fair share and the conversion of those two wealth indicators into ability to pay. Now keep in mind, the higher, from the state's perspective, the higher they can push the local fair share, the lower the state's obligation is to backfill in order to reach adequacy. So the state has its own budget constraints, and it's been speculated by us and other districts in our position that they may start with what they have available and then back into the local fair share by adjusting those multipliers. That's the answer we're trying to get legally, through legal means, and over a course of years, they have not given up that information. But regardless, that is the position that we're currently in. So the appropriations, so how is that money spent? And in my mind, there's really only two categories: direct instruction and everything else, right? Because the core purpose of this organization is academic, it's educational, right? So the blue portions of this chart are all, whether it's gen ed, special ed, or athletics and activities, which is considered in the instructional bucket. 60% of our funds go towards that. The remaining categories are to create the best conditions for that direct instruction to happen, right? Whether that be student supports, and that's guidance counselors, the school nurse, things like that, or it's also the curriculum support, like our R&D department that prepares curriculum and provides professional development teachers, all to create the ideal condition in the classroom for direct instruction. The other areas, facilities, transportation, administration, and capital are other. You need the facility to be in shape, transportation to be in place, and capital maintain your facility and equipment. So, you know, and Chuck had mentioned earlier about where we stand on spending, and you know, there's a downside to Freehold Regional faring as well as it does in this spending metric. So what this is it's the Taxpayer's Guide to Education Spending. And that's, the state takes independently audited information, spending information, processes that and presents it in a comparable form. So, you know, there are different categories, as you can see, so that it's apples to apples comparisons. You want to see where you stand compared to your sibling districts, right? They're going to be the best point of reference for you. And it's also important to note that, you know, high school kids cost more than middle school kids, that cost more than elementary school kids. And that's part of that cost model that determines how much it should make, and that should make sense to all of us. So the last two columns, the next to last column, the 19,078,000 is all of the high school only school districts, which are all regional school districts. There are 31 in the state, which we are part of. The average of that group is $19 million. Freehold Regional is at $14 million.
19,000.
I'm sorry?
19,000.
19,000, I'm sorry, what did I say?
Million.
19,000
Really
per
be
student.
bankrupt.
Thank you.
A lot of millions. Really be bankrupt.
But now, there's some economy of scale there. Because of those 31 districts, we're the largest of those districts, right? There are some, we have over 10,000 kids. There are some in the 6,000s, 3,000s, but others are small. So it's going to be harder for them to achieve that. But, you know, when it comes back to the funding formula and funding schools, when you look at Freehold Regional, with the opportunities that are available for our students, which we heard from two of our student reps today talk about, that range of opportunities at this price point, this should be the model that the state is after. And through numerous meetings with legislators that we've had along the way, they don't disagree with that. But in the grander scheme of things, they need to bring the formula into balance, right, where it had been just ignored for several years, and they had to bring it back to what they believe is the design intent. We, again, continue to challenge their measure of the local fair share and our ability to pay. The downside of being at this kind of price point is there's not as many places to go when revenues are reduced, right? So we're running a pretty lean organization and providing many student opportunities, but we're doing that in a very efficient way as the taxpayer guide indicates. So, and Chuck had mentioned it before, our cost per pupil is 25% lower. Our administrative cost is also 25% lower than the other 31, the average of the other 31. So both of those areas are running fairly lean. So in addition to an additional 20 staff members and cuts to the entire district, whether it's the school principals who saw 10% cuts in the amount of allocation that they have to work with, and all department heads. There's pain that's throughout the organization. But the most noteworthy is the elimination of courtesy busing. So the state mandates busing for any students that live over 2.5 miles. Freehold Regional has transported 100% of its students, which are all high school students, which is a bit of an anomaly. There are not many districts remaining that provide 100% busing to their student population, particularly their high school students. So within this budget is built that to move to that state mandated 2.5 miles. That's going to affect approximately a third of our students. That will reduce the number of runs approximately 25%, bus routes that is. and it will save $3.5 million. So it's a big ticket item in order to bring our budget into balance. There will be, the line's going to be a hard line, and hazardous conditions, safety concerns from home to your school of attendance, which that's the measure, and it's on public roadways or walkways. So it is, if you were to walk there, 2.5 miles. It's not as the crow flies. There's no consideration given with regard to eligibility for transportation. Students will either be eligible for transportation or not eligible for transportation. And the best thing that we can do is to give ample notice to the community, which began in our February meeting, and we've talked about it in the years leading up to the budget being presented tonight. We had consultants who do this for a living run through those numbers for us. They presented to the board the status of their work in February. Tonight it's being adopted as part of this budget, and there will be communications out to the affected members of our community over the course of the next 4 months. And so hopefully parents have enough time to decide what's right for their family and make arrangements accordingly. So some of the other impact of that is what's it going to look like around the schools, traffic-wise. And our principals, we've reached out to all of our communities and the township administrators. The principals are working with police chiefs to manage that. Although there'll be fewer buses there, there'll be a lot more cars coming in. So that's going to take, I'm sure there'll be a period of time where that gets sorted out to, get the right traffic flow, and it'll be different in each school. The 1/3 of students is district-wide. The breakdown of that per high school varies, right? So you have Freehold Borough, which is the most heavily impacted, and on the other end, Colts Neck and Howe are the least impacted. And it's all just simply a matter of geography and where students live in relation to the school that they attend. The other communities, the other 4 schools or the other 3 schools are in the 30 to 40% range of impacted, so about 1/3 for those other schools. So, in the majority of our communities, there's significant impact on this, and, overall, 1/3 of our families being impacted, which is more than 3,000 families. That's certainly a significant number. And the dollar savings is also a significant number.
God bless you.
Thank you.
So where do we land property tax-wise with all of this? So what I have here is what I'm working with the Monmouth County tax assessor to really try and measure what the tax impact is going to be from our increase in property taxes. This is how it shakes out, but I need to qualify this. Monmouth County is a pilot county in a program that annually converts the assessed values of all properties into their current market value, right? So that means rateable bases go up, and the byproduct of that is tax rates go down. The message here is the most important thing is your individual property and how it relates to the activity in your municipality. So while this looks like really good news, it really is specific to what your town's situation is. So we'd encourage you to check in with them, and that'll be the true measure of what your property tax impact will be. So finally, from here forward, a lot of those strategies that we've used to balance the budget along the way, they are running their course. And that impact is going to be felt, but still the primary objective here is to continue to press legislators to address an obvious flaw in the funding formula. Some of the recommendations that we've made along the way is to, right out of the gate, ensure that no district is below adequacy. right? And that the state's meeting its constitutional obligation to provide a thorough and efficient education, to provide enough money as identified by adequacy. We think there's opportunities to correct situations which disproportionately impact districts like ours. For example, our vocational students. They are not counted as our students. So there is no aid attached to our vocational students. Tuition plus transportation for our vocational students is $8.2 million in this upcoming year, with no corresponding consideration in state aid. That's something, and being a high school only district, 100% of our students are eligible to attend a vocational school, where obviously a K-12 district, it's a far less percentage of their total student population. We think that makes sense. To stabilize the wealth multipliers for a more predictable and equitable measure of local fair share, we received that information in March. Prior to receiving that information, we have absolutely no idea what our state aid is going to be. And we cannot, with any degree of confidence, predict what it would be. We can only simply use the multipliers that were in place the previous year, and if they were the same, which they haven't been, then this is what it would look like. But at this point, we've been diminished to so little state aid that there's not much left to take from us. So stabilize the wealth multipliers and make them a more realistic measure of a community's ability to pay for its own education. Consider funding considerations for districts unable to access their local fair share. This is that $152 million levy to $184 million levy. We can't get there with a 2% cap on an increase in the levy. It would take us a decade to get from where we are to where we need to be, even at this point in time. So that's obviously what's driving us being under adequacy and being in a financial situation that we are. And also meaningful incentives for regional school districts. And we know that we make a strong case for regional districts being effective in both terms of price, but also in student opportunities. I mean, there are 12 magnet programs, 2 IB schools, full range of athletics and activities. There's something for every student here going to our comprehensive high schools. And, you know, we think it should serve as a model. We think a financial incentive should be awarded for districts that meet certain spending criteria, and that may encourage other communities to also consider regionalization for both financial reasons and for student opportunity reasons. So over the years here, those are the points that we keep hammering home, ideas that they can potentially use to help correct the course. But that advocacy remains the most critical work that we have ahead of us. Optimizing our capital funding opportunities through state grants, which on tonight's agenda, there's approval to submit for a state grant, and the state grants, the pockets of money become available at the state periodically that will fund 40% of capital projects for districts. It's a limited pot of money, and so getting something done at a 40% discount makes all the sense in the world. The problem with it is that we need to come up with the other 60%, right? So that's additional pressure on our budget of where we're able to pull to our side of that match in order to make those projects happen. We have $1.1 million worth of projects submitted in this round of facility funding from the state, and we'll know shortly whether or not, to what degree we have awards associated with those projects, which are all HVAC related. So it's all our heating and ventilation, mechanical equipment things. So that's the work ahead of us. I also noted up there, just to give a sense of scale, based on the information we know now, we're projecting a $10 million deficit for fiscal year 25. That's a significant deficit that we're going to have to make up through a combination of things, including different strategies on funding capital, but also cuts to those areas that are outside of our core mission here, which is educational academics. But eventually, over time, in this trajectory, that's going to start to hit those areas as well. And that's going to significantly change what this district looks like. So, Board, I'll open it up to questions. And I know Board received a more thorough report a couple weeks ago, and it's something that's been a subject of conversation for several years now on the Board. But I'll open up to the Board for any specific questions at this time. Kathy?
I have a question. As far as the county schools are concerned, you said 8.2 million vocational schools. That's going to the Monmouth County schools, correct?
Well, it's tuition and transportation.
And transportation, right. How are those schools compensated? Like, does the county put money into
County
those?
does
Is
put
it
money
only
in.
by the kids, each
No,
municipality?
they also receive state aid because the kids are associated with the vocational district, not with us. So it's as if they don't exist. In other words, let me say, if every kid in Freehold Regional went to a vocational school,
Yeah.
our adequacy budget would be zero. Because under the state, the way the state views it, we would have 0 kids. Yet we would have tuition and transportation associated with all of those students, right? So
But the tuition's higher than ours to go
no,
to those schools.
no, it's
Individual
it's
student.
seeing increases each year with the impact inflation and costs and staffing across the board. But they have a different funding mechanism. The county, tuition, state aid, and that's the group of that is what they use to run their schools.
But we give them what we, what it
I'll
costs
tell
our
you, in their
students.
budget, they don't have a transportation line item.
Okay.
That's all on us.
Mr. Boyce,
Yes.
so when we speak about transportation, this is a very difficult vote tonight, of course. We've been discussing this for months. I would go to finance meetings, I'm not even on the committee, just to look, maybe we'll find something else to do instead of cutting courtesy busing. But we're looking at transportation now, and we're really going to be cleaning it up. Like, we're going to be changing routes and
Yeah,
making
that's
it
an
more
excellent point.
cost-effective. Because, like, 11% of our budget is really transportation. Isn't it close to 11% of our budget, 10% of our budget?
Yeah, I mean, on
That's a
the
lot.
handout here, it's
Yeah.
21, $22 million, even with that reduction. But you make a good point, Mr. Bruno, in that the students that live beyond 2.5 miles and will still have transportation, there are changes going on there as well, right? So we are, redesigning, pulling more kids together on bus stops for efficiency purposes. So whereas in the past, we may have dropped into a neighborhood and stopped at several corners, more of those stops are going to be consolidated, and that does create some efficiencies, and there's a layer of savings on that as well, but the
everybody-
lion's share of that savings is
So
courtesy
everyone's
busing.
going to be feeling something.
Everybody's going to feel
Feeling
it in one
something.
way or the other.
I have a question. Why not cut administration costs?
It's the public outcry, right? Those administrators. Look, over the lifespan of our reductions, the actual highest percentage cut that we've made is to administration. So that has been where we've carved out the largest percentage, and that's why we are 25% below the state average. And this budget, in those 19.4 positions, there's 2 additional administrative positions that are also being cut in this proposed budget. So we've drawn down our administration extensively. It is the largest percentage cut we've made over the past several years.
It just seems to me like every year we seem to lose an administrator, at least at the building level. Am I wrong?
No, I mean, we've lost a number across the district over the years. I mean, they've been reduced.
This is why that $14,000, I almost said 14 million, the $14,000 per pupil is so low.
It's very low. It's
That's why-
lower
that's one of the
than the
reasons-
average of any configuration
But that's one of the reasons why, because our administrative
when we
costs are low.
have all high school students.
Right.
Which would mean we should be the highest of any configuration. So, yeah, and the high schools, listen, I mean, I think if you look at our administrative cost per pupil being 25% lower than our sibling districts, I think that tells a clear story about where we stand.
You know, the interesting factor in the SFRA itself, right, is that you have a school funding model that gives no consideration to how much you spend, right?
Correct.
There is zero consideration to how financially efficient you are within the model itself, right? And so one of the things that, you know, we've noted repeatedly is that in some cases, you're watching districts across the state that are well above adequacy receive millions of dollars in additional aid this year. So 2 districts alone received over $51 million in additional aid this year. And the only reason I'm highlighting that is because both of those particular districts are over adequacy, and that $50 million would have kept the rest of the state whole. That's that other $50 million.
What their cost per
So
pupil is.
their cost per pupil in some cases are almost literally double ours, Mr. Bruno. So this is, you know, as a high school district, we're the lowest spending district in Monmouth County now. Of those 50 some odd districts, we are the lowest spending. That's, while efficiency is a point of pride, that is dangerous at a certain point in time in terms of where your funding lies. And again, there were a number of simple asks that we had of our legislators at the start of this. This is not a surprise. When S2 came down, Mr. Boyce and I sat with the legislative leadership in this area, in the state, and we said, this is what's going to happen if you pull this model out over 7 years. This is how destructive it's going to be. We asked for simple guardrails. A simple guardrail would have been no district can be reduced more than what they can generate on their tax levy, right? Think about that. That makes sense. So you're going to cut a school district. You reduce them by the amount that they can then generate in their tax levy. You do it over a period of time where districts can more effectively manage it. That was a simple ask 6 years ago. That was something that could have been done legislatively easily. It was not. We've talked over and over again about the insaneness of the county vocational system in Monmouth County and how that disproportionately impacts our school system. And I've said it over and over again, I'll be very clear, we support those opportunities for kids. Those are wonderful schools for those kids to be able to attend. However, the way that they are funded disproportionately impacts our district. First and foremost, a much higher percentage of our students lands on the shores of those schools. So when you look at Biotech High School in Monmouth County, 50% of those students originated from Freehold Regional. So our students are accepted at a higher rate than basically every other district in Monmouth with the exception of Homedale. And I believe Homedale has maybe 115 students in the county vocational system. We have 600. We pay for transportation for all 600. The total cost, we pay for tuition for all 600. And that money doesn't even get factored into our equalization aid. So just think about that. Now, I say this over and over to the powers that be, and every time I say it, they're surprised to hear it. No matter how many times I say it, year over year over year. So my only hope is that if anything, if nothing gets done before the election in November, if nothing changes on this circumstance, we'll look back on this budget as easy. That's where we're headed next year if nothing changes. There's no fool sitting in this room. It's an election year. The time for something to happen is this year. For some level of sanity in terms of that the state has to understand that you can't lift up some districts and actively destroy others with your school funding formula. I do believe, and I've said this repeatedly, we may be the only state that has reduced districts the way we've reduced them during the pandemic. I don't want to see the governor out there talking about mental health needs and all that with what that formula has done to districts like us. It's incredibly disingenuous. Because while other districts are adding counselors and adding support staff and adding staff and giving money back, by the way, in tax relief rather than utilize it for students, we're struggling to keep the lights on here. So, and nobody thinks about the long-term implications of this. The long-term implication of S2 is that it has reduced the overall spend on public education in the state. So as some of these other districts receive additional funds and say, well, we'll give that back as tax relief rather than spend it on our children, my first question is, did you really need it then? Right? If it went right back. My second question is, that was another simple ask that we said to the state. We said, if you're gonna just give money to other districts, right? And many of these districts were underfunded for years. They were in the same situation we're in now prior to this. So they deserve the funding they got as well. I want to be clear on that. However, the ones who were giving it back as tax relief were actually taking dollars that were intended for the K-12 public ed system in the state and reducing that total pot of what we're doing in the state for the children that we serve. That's the legacy of the past few years. That will be the long-term legacy. And the things that happen in this district, Sean and I, Mr. Boyce and I were talking about this the other day. It will be very difficult now. It will be an adjustment. It will be 5 to 7 years from now where folks will really be feeling it. It will be a decade when our infrastructure is really just beyond repair, and the communities will have to grapple with it at that point in time. And that is going to happen if something doesn't change. Everybody's talking now, I'll give you the perfect example. When I testified at the Senate budget hearing, the Senate budget chair said, we understand we need to tweak it. And I said, but with all due respect, that's what everybody says every year. Nothing happens, right? So what are the tweaks? And then when we said, the Senate budget chair said, it's obvious that the funding formula is working. And I said, sir, with all due respect, if it was working, we wouldn't have spent 5 years involved in a lawsuit trying to figure out how it's even calculated. So this is where we are legislatively in the state. It's disheartening that some of the districts like ours are in the situation that we've arrived at, and that is what is forcing a number of these very, very difficult decisions that they are not going to just strain our school system. They are going to strain our municipalities and our communities at large greatly. That's what's happening.
I'd like to just, basically, I think what's happening is we're a victim of our own efficiency because you've been maintaining and running at such a low cost that we have nothing to take from. None of us on this board want to take away busing from any student, but if it's that versus the classroom instruction, which is already over 450 classes, over 30, we're left with this because we are so efficient. So, and I just hope people realize that this is the state formula and that they reach out to their legislatures and that they, do something before November, so hopefully we won't be in this situation next year.
So a couple comments on that. You know, the decisions that we've made in this budget and the decisions that we'll be making in the future, they're not yes or no decisions. It's this or that, and none of the options are good options. And if you reach out to legislators and if you talk to your legislators, I think the point to drive home is that it is indefensible for them to have any school district below adequacy. When the state itself quantifies a thorough and efficient education and then does not provide means to have the resources to meet that number, then they are by definition not providing a thorough and efficient education. So it's an indefensible position that they're in for any of the districts that are below adequacy. But yes, Ms. Higley, you're right. It's difficult decisions now and more to come. Kathy?
It's only going to affect the taxpayers. Our taxes will be going up higher to compensate.
Not under the
for
current situation
2%.
because there's 2% cap.
We can't do the 2%.
So.
Going above the 2%.
Yes, which, you know, in this year, we did take an opportunity to go above the 2% for a tax levy cap adjustment. And what's behind that is that we're in our second year of moving to a fully self-funded health insurance platform. And so a typical arrangement for districts is that you pay a premium for the people that you do have working there to the insurance company, and that effectively transfers all of the risk to them. If claims are really high, that's on the insurance company. It's not on the district, at least not that year, because those claims drive your subsequent year's premiums, right? So they catch up with you. But if it's a really good year, then the insurance company makes out, right? And you don't see a corresponding reduction in premiums in the subsequent year. So we have the scale to be able to consider and make that decision to move to a fully self-funded. So we'll keep the risk, right? So good years will benefit from, but part of that scenario, in order to mitigate risk in a number of areas here, is to set up reserves, right? So there's reserves for incurred but not reported claims, and there's a corridor, some insurance language that for self-funded platforms, there's additional reserves necessary because we're assuming additional risk. And because health insurance premiums have risen so much, we were able to access that and increase our tax levy this year above the 2%. But for the last 5 years, we've been at 2%.
You can only do that once?
Yeah, so it's that particular health benefit adjustment is, it's the availability of it is based on the increases in the state health benefits plan, which we are not in.
Right.
But that they have a 15% increase this year. So that unlocks that opportunity for us to fund our reserves, which is normally done over a 3 to 5 year period when you're transitioning into self-funding.
So just a little bit more context, Mr. Boyce, as well. So I do think it's important, you know, some of the board members had said earlier tonight that there was a rumor that there might be more money. The final state budget is not struck until June. So there is time. There's time for the community to certainly lobby the governor, who we know we have one of the largest surpluses that we've ever had, and for a fraction, for a literal cup of coffee on that surplus, no district in this state needs to be cut this year. I think that's an important reality.
By we, you mean the state.
Correct. Yeah, we don't have that surplus. I mean, the state of New Jersey. Yes, thank you, Mr. Boyce. The state of New Jersey has unprecedented surplus at this point in time. We've all seen the increase in student needs as a result of the pandemic. We've seen it. There is no denying that the closure of our schools fundamentally impacted our youth. We can argue and debate what the right decision was. the reality of that is post-COVID, we have seen an increase in student need across the board. Socially, academically, it is there and it's apparent. The time for the state to say, we are going to invest in our most important resource, which is our children, is now. The community can certainly raise their voices through June about what that final budget may ultimately look like. There are certainly pressure points that can be pursued. So, and I am thankful that Senator Gopal got that $4 million in stabilization aid, supplemental stabilization aid for us. But that, they were actually deliberate in saying, this is a one-time adjustment. You know, we're going to continue to run the formula, and you're gonna have to address that next year. And now remember, when we were cut $4.5 million more than anticipated, we had about 6 weeks to figure that out. So the comparative, sort of model to that would be, you've paid a mortgage for a year, and suddenly 6 weeks out, your mortgage jumps 20% with no explanation, right? It's a very difficult thing to plan for. So there is still time until the final state budget is struck. There are billions in unspent federal dollars. We're actually one of the worst states in the nation in terms of releasing those funds. So there are certainly things that legislatively we can advocate for, from a community perspective we can advocate for, and on our webpage under advocating for our students are clear contacts of all of your legislative leaders, and I would encourage our community to raise their voice before that final budget is struck in June. Unfortunately, our timelines aren't the state's, so we'll pass the budget that we pass, but that doesn't mean that that won't assist us down the road.